so I'm just going to read a bit of the bio. Professor Gaye Theresa Johnson, who is an associate professor of African American Studies and Chicano Studies here at UCLA, writes and teaches on race and racism, cultural history, spatial politics, and political economy. She's written books such as Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles. Also co-edited with Alex The Futures of Black Radicalism, which was a phenomenal work that really extends the work of Black Marxism from Cedric Robinson in 1983, that was reprinted with the foreword by Robin D.G. Kelly in 2000, and is working on Let's Get Free, social protest at the intersection of mass incarceration and immigrant detention. Now recently, Professor Johnson was awarded, along with Professor Ananya Roy, Maite Zumaira, and Lacey Abrego, the Soya Seminar, which is a wonderful, very large grant for 1 year. Maybe she'll talk about it after with you, or she escapes outside after this out of embarrassment. But it's on sanctuary spaces, titled Rewilding Humanism. And really thinks across multiple geopolitical, social, and disciplinary contexts where people can really think about what it means in this moment to have a sanctuary city or sanctuary spaces, that is spaces of sanctuary. And I'm just really deeply honored. I also have to mention as I close to have Professor Johnson as a colleague, really someone who has shepherded and stewarded not just my work personally, but really the commitment, again, as Robin D.G. Kelly mentioned at the start of today, the forging the relationship between so-called Black studies and Black European studies, which of course we understand are one and the same. So without further ado, I put this here for official reasons, and we have Professor Gaye Theresa Johnson.
Hello, everyone. How is everyone today, at the end of this beautiful, beautiful faces looking at me? It's really nice to be here. I'm so honored to be asked to be closing this day, but also just honored to be in this space with you all and to see everyone. As I was here earlier and then I came back and I was just watching everyone watch the panelists and engage, and it's just really beautiful to see how much this has animated conversation, but also a spirit of collaboration. Most especially, thank you to SA for telling me to bring the mic closer to my face, and also for inviting me to speak with you. And I really want to ask this question for you to reflect on. I did the same thing earlier. It's all right. How important is it to create these spaces of, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about you falling out of me too. I'm sorry. Black people, yes. All right. All right, don't get the giggles, okay. How important is it to create these spaces of dynamic conversation? How important is it? I mean, that's it, that's the tweet. How important is it to create these spaces of dynamic conversation where we do more than the work of dismantling logics, more than just writing and thinking against the subjects of Blackness created in white dominance and violence, but where we're each recommitting to the uplift of the brilliance of Black intellectual and creative strategies in our work and in our persons as well. And I want to shout that out specifically as the significance of the vision thrown forth by the conference organizers. And I want to honor that vision in each of the papers and each of the comments and ruminations that are presented here today. To gather around the matter of Blackness in Europe is to disrupt philosophies of Western humanism that underpin our understandings of freedom, belonging, nation, and even protection. And to do this is also to decenter Europe and the West as the place where all thoughts generative about race are born. Yes, a practice within which all of us are trained, and many of us continue to work our way against and through. So the alternatives are many, and the papers and the comments that were offered today engage these alternatives, and they gift us with a plethora of frameworks of human dignity and freedom that are rooted in anti-colonial and abolitionist struggle. So today, I want to emphasize two ideas as we come to the close. And those two ideas are liberation and regeneration. And I want to encourage accompaniment with these ideas as I also generate questions for you, brilliant scholars and students. And so let's start with liberation. I'm going to go kind of slowly because here I'm invoking the work of Cedric Robinson and Elizabeth Robinson to talk about freedom. And as we all know, the brilliant Cedric Robinson was also an incredible word trickster. And it was not always easy to understand the man. And so I'm going to take it somewhat slowly, and I encourage you to call out if you are saying, let's go over that again. Can we go over that again? And I encourage us to help and explain to and with and amongst each other what these ideas are about, to chew on them, to metabolize them, to really work with them and shape them. So if we start with liberation, I want to begin with this quote by Elizabeth Robinson, who was Cedric Robinson's wife of 50 years. In the preface to the Futures of Black Radicalism, she writes, "If we are to move the Black radical tradition forward, it is imperative that we understand that it is not utopian. Rather, it is about the questing for freedom. It is about the necessity of recognizing the importance of struggle, regardless of outcomes." So again, about the necessity of recognizing the importance of struggle, regardless of outcomes. Nor, she says, does it begin and end intellectually. So in this preface, just as a little bit of a background, she creates this remarkable dialogue between herself and Cedric, because they had agreed to write it together. But he passed away before they could start together writing this. So she does this brilliant thing, which is that she engages him posthumously through response and annotation of a talk that he gave in 2013. So she writes the preface with him, even though he's already gone, right? Her husband of 50 years, right? And it was just such a gift that when we received the preface, because we thought they made true, they came through on their promise to write this together because of her, how she held that space even as he was gone, which is also part of the Black radical tradition. What Toni Morrison talked about in terms of her own self, her own personhood being kind of an interlocutor between the living and the dead. That is what that reminds me of so much. Now, in this passage, she's honing a point that Cedric makes about liberation. He's at first describing the genius that was Pauline Hopkins, who was a 19th century Black American writer who takes up what he calls the interrogation of a way out. Beyond demands for equality and freedom, Pauline Hopkins pursued Pan-Africanism and ponders Black women's liberation. She rejected assimilation as a collective tragedy, which is partly why Cedric recounts her career and contributions are subsequently eviscerated by Booker T. Washington, and her work is not rediscovered until well after her death. And he explains her writing in a context in which there is much attention to the creation of sovereignty vis-a-vis 19th and early 20th century Black writing toward establishing a Black past. Not just Black American writing, Black feminist writing, Black European writing, Black writing in the Americas, through the recognition of Africa in the works of Black intellectuals, through the recognition of Blacks under European and Western regimes of race. And Robinson argues that in reconstituting Blacks as a historical people with a past, in which we were in many respects one. This kind of came up earlier. I remember you asking this question, what happens when we're one? Present and future sovereignty become imaginable. So now to this, he points out that historically, and this is where it gets kind of Cedric right here, is now to this he points out that historically, one of the weaknesses, he says, of Black radicalism has been that it doesn't necessarily imagine a future in which justice is certain. So again, one of the weaknesses, Cedric Robinson says, of Black radicalism has been that it doesn't necessarily imagine a future in which justice is certain. So today there are several excellent papers about the way that Black people build sustainable conversation around Black community making, uplift, and internationalism, interpolating Black struggle in Ferguson into the recognition of Black humanity in France, speaking Black through aesthetics, language, and the archive and the classroom. And so here's my first incitement, is to uplift these struggles as an inextricable part of the imagination of liberation in these practices. So this may sound a little strange at first, because I'm sure you've been doing this all day, but bear with me because I'm coming to this point about how Robinson imagines this weakness about Black radicalism, not necessarily imagining a future in which justice is certain. So he explains that in Marxism, where the proletariat inevitably win, or in Black Christianity, where Blacks inevitably dwell in a utopic future, Black radicalism provides us only with the promise of future liberation. Cedric says, only when that radicalism is costumed or achieves an envelope in Black Christianity is there a certainty to it. That's the only place where we, as Black people, really utter a certainty, is when the radicalism is costumed or achieves an envelope in Black Christianity. Otherwise, he says, it's about a kind of resistance that doesn't promise triumph or victory at the end, only just liberation. He offers two examples in which Black people articulated this offense. So this offense, but he's referring to the offense of referring to just liberation, like it's just a promise, not actually contoured freedom, right? He says, the first is slave fugitivity as an action of self-removal. Slavery, he says, is simply unacceptable. But so was the inability to see the contours of freedom clearly demarcated in its stead. He says that rather than going after slavery, fugitives sought to recreate their homelands through marronage. And rather than confront the system as the system, they removed themselves from it altogether. So in other words, the institution was so offensive, and the uncontoured idea of freedom as its mere opposite so insufficient, that fugitives simply withdraw. They recreate their homelands in new spaces. New visions of freedom bloom, rooted in traditions recovered, recouped, reimagined. Second, he recalls the scene in Daughters of the Dust, when Eula talks about how Igbo landing gets its name, where slaves confronted with their futures drowned themselves between the boats and the shore. No nice package at the end, he says, only that you would be free. This is the promise. And I read this as a recognition, and I tell you why. He says this recognition comes out of the insult to African identities that slavery represents. Slavery is unacceptable, but what's also unacceptable, again, is the lack of imagination around liberation. So let's take for a second this idea of freedom as itself unacceptable, and this is where Cedric Robinson distinguishes himself, and what an understatement. He's so fully aware of the immensity of the Black radical tradition, as well as of the ways that Achille Mbembe has denoted how social theory has failed to account for time, as lived in its multiplicity and its simultaneities, its presences, its absences, beyond the lazy categories of permanence and change beloved of so many historians. Robinson asks us to return to the promise of liberation, not as a destination, but necessarily as a recognition of the value of struggle itself. Struggle, the value of struggle. So these questions echo for me as a method to critique dominant paradigms of European and Western humanism as the ways that they frame these notions of what we have rights to as human beings and what kind of dignities we are entitled to. And so this is my incitement for us, is to think about how struggle itself, not just the promise of liberation, refuses narratives of Blackness that serve white supremacy and imperialism. And so thinking about struggle as itself valuable re-centers these forms of being and knowing that emanate from being cast out in the world. And in centering those, how to lift up relationalities, how to lift up connections here today and beyond that make possible the imagination of other worlds. Today, more than ever, as we continue to believe in Black radical traditions and practices, we have to find the possibilities in struggle itself, but also imagine more clearly what freedom means. And I think of this space as also a site of struggle, trying to imagine more clearly what freedom means of beautiful and dynamic congregation and thought. This place, this conference, as a site of joy and brilliance. So can struggle be a nourishing place? And also, if defined by that nourishment, can struggle be a place where we at once refuse these logics of Eurocentrism and disrupt a reinscription of Western genealogies? I think it can be. And in this kind of space that we create, everywhere we go, can we recognize that while contemporary European and American Western notions of belonging and refuge often advance this ethics of like humanitarianism, cosmopolitanism, we emphasize frameworks of human dignity and freedom that are rooted in anti-colonial struggle and dreams of a brilliant kind of freedom. So this is my first kind of incitement, is this idea of liberation. And secondly, regeneration. In the US, we refer to the asylum crisis to demarcate the present moment with respect to the border, to xenophobia and racism against migrants, particularly brown and Black migrants. And there is a lot to be learned from this. Because also, this is not a crisis for many of us, it's the way it's been, as we know. And there's also much for those of us struggling in this moment, here in this place, in these spaces, to be learned from the ways that Europe is also enacting self-securitization. Because with self-securitization, we know, and this is what we know in this moment as we hear 45 all the time talking about these secure borders and protecting ourselves and what citizenship means, that with self-securitization, anything is possible. There's no limits. That limitlessness includes extreme racism and racist expression. From racism as a pariah condition, for example, in Europe, since 15th century, Blacks, Muslims, Jews, and now Jews occupying a rather awkward space now, to the reinvocation and the embrace of racist expression in the name of post-raciality, self-securitization, keeping ourselves safe in the face of migration, becomes the driving relation of the day. To keep Britain tidy, to keep Brussels secure, to keep Paris civil. Even talking about it feels degenerative in many respects, not regenerative. Many of us who are charged with studying these things, with teaching about these assaults in specific detail, or for those of us who are organized, or even more for those of us who are directly affected by these insults in such a way as to add them to the increasing difficulty of working under these conditions. This can create a kind of ongoing trauma and fatigue. And you all know what I mean. I don't even have to explain it, I'm sure. But to understand, but to refuse that in some way, right, if we can. And there are many privileges that come with that enactment. But creating the spaces where that is possible is where I want to start with this idea of regeneration. Because to understand not Blackness in the context of Europe, but Europe in the context of trans-historical Black struggle, to understand Black radicalism as the heart and the future of humanity, undertaken as a multivalent, transnational, trans-historical project. This is a site from which questions about citizenship and belonging, about sovereignty, about state power, about law, all of those things can be reimagined. And it's a site from which we implement imaginations, we implement histories, we implement practices of inclusion, of integration, of community, of hospitality, of grace, of love, and we extend them through transnational networks of conversation and activism. So this is how I believe that struggle can become a space of regeneration, even though it seems like the definition of struggle these days, because it is defined for us, doesn't feel like it can be that way. In any struggle, resistance is at the core. We resist, we learn about power, we engage, we fight, hopefully we smash, we learn from our triumphs, we learn from our defeats, right? And then we rest, or we recoup, we regroup, before we once again engage in resistance, whatever that looks like. But what if we lingered between these last two steps, where we learn, where we rest in community, where we rest in the part of the struggle that allows us to regenerate? How do our practices of community uplift and nourishment then change? How does resistance then change? What does struggle become then redefined? If we allow ourselves to regenerate through these radical traditions of reconnection, of mutual support and acceptance, of a recognition of the power in a politics of radical belonging, an idea I think we could ponder all day, then regeneration becomes the most important part of struggle, the most important part of resistance, and the most important space of protection and brilliance, but also a site where we plant seeds of rebellion. Regeneration can act as a reminder of the specific inheritances of struggle that we believe the futures of Black radicalism depend on. And this is why Robin Kelley reminds us that C.L.R. James and W.E.B. Du Bois turned to slave rebellions in order to chart a future beyond fascism. So they turned to the past in order to chart the future. Amilcar Cabral, one of Robinson's favorite subjects, understood that a radical future for Africa required that we return to the source. Regeneration can draw us into closer proximity, not to merely the description of liberation, but closer to the spirit of abolition, the work of revolutionary change, the relentless critique of oppression by all of us who are engaged in that work. So more than the promise of liberation, not as a destination, but necessarily as a recognition of the value of struggle itself, of rest, of regeneration. And so what is the practice of regeneration that we find in the papers presented here today, in the interventions presented here today, but also just in the conversations here today? Not just the ones up here, but the ones at the back of the room, at the lunch table. How are all of these things helping us to rethink Black struggle, to ponder it as a space of regeneration, not simply as constant resistance that leads to a kind of burnout that's both individual and can become collective as well? So again, this means that it's not just the thoughts expressed here today, but also the congregation that is important. Above all, that we're here, present, dreaming pasts and futures of Blackness, especially because Europe is predicated on us. Thank you.